Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Welcome to the Pacific Regional Urban Resilience Hub at COP26. The session of Strengthening Urban Resilience in Pacific. I am Jing Ning, Director of Urban Development and Water Division in the Pacific Department at ADB. Hello from Manila. Urban centers in Pacific are extremely vulnerable to climate-related disasters. Due to climate change, the frequency and the magnitude of natural disasters and their impacts are likely to increase, including floods, droughts, and also the sea level rise will become a very significant threat to all coastal communities. This session will present ADB region-wide urban resilient development, the program, and also how we address the impacts of climate change in urban and water sector. We will listen to the pilot work of building code study in Fiji, followed by how ADB helps Pacific countries achieving water security and climate resilience. And then the practices on resilient solid waste management in Pacific countries. We will have panel discussion, and please submit your questions using the chat box here. First, let me welcome Ms. Vasiti Soko. She will talk about the disaster and the building code in Fiji. She is the director of National Disaster Management Office in Fiji. She has more than 15 years experience in the highly technical field of geospatial science and surveying. She has assisted several significant projects while working for the Fijian government, including developing a disaster integrated system prior taking on her current role. She also worked across a number of regional projects in different countries, Nauru, Micronesia, Palau, Vanuatu, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Australia. She is currently the co-chair for Pacific Technical Working Group on Human Mobility, deputy chair for Asia Pacific Technical Working Group on Disaster-Related Statistics, and co-chair for the Pacific Response to Disaster Displacement Advisory Board. As the first female director for Fiji's National Disaster Management Office, Vasiti just won the inaugural Women's International Network on Disaster Risk Reduction Excellence Award just 3 weeks ago. So congratulations, Vasiti. Please, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, and Bulavinaka from Fiji. My topic this morning will be on disasters and building code. Next, please. For the benefit of those that don't know where Fiji is, so Fiji has a total land mass of over 1,904 square meters, and majority of the land sits on the two main islands, which is Vanua Levu and Viti Levu. Majority of our populations as well are residing in urban centers, which gives us more reason today to discuss the importance about building code. We have a total of 132 islands, of which 106 are uninhabited and 522 are smaller inlets. So you can see how vulnerable Fiji's location is when it comes to natural disasters. Next, please. Just to put some context into the presentation, how vulnerable again is Fiji? This cyclone season, we have been informed that Fiji has a total of 3 that is expected to hit Fiji. Of the 3 cyclones, 2 are expected to be high severity. Photos that you see on the slide, these are photos of last year's cyclone season, where we had a La Nina and a lot of rain. So our building codes or our buildings and infrastructure are not only under threat because of strong cyclones or strong winds, but also due to heavy rainfall that caused massive flooding. And again, as I'd alluded to, the photos before you were taken from last year. Next, please. Just to give a background on the building code, in 1980, the National Building Code of Fiji was developed under the Australian Aid Program and published in the 1990s. Following that, Fiji developed a construction manual related to the National Building Code. This became a companion document to the National Building Code of Fiji. In 2004, the National Building Code, which is now regulated under the Public Health Act of 2004, administered by the Central Board of Health, under the Act, mandated to perform the building inspection functions for our building code. Fast forward to the current revision, and I would like to offer our sincere thank you to ADB for coming on board to join government in updating our current building code. As you can see on the screen, from the revolutions of the history behind the building code for Fiji, you'll also notice that the category of cyclones continues to increase, and not only increase, but also the number of cyclones that are now happening in our region are becoming more frequent than ever before. Again, reiterating that our infrastructure are now under threat, not only, again, as I've mentioned, from the cyclone, as you can see, but also from flooding as well as heavy downpour. Next, please. So what are the few things that also, in addition to the impacts of cyclones as well as the impacts of sea level rise? As the previous slide had indicated, Fiji has had not only category 3 or category 4 cyclones. In a span of the revolution of Fiji's building code, we've had 2 tropical cyclone category 5. These posed a lot of questions, a lot of lessons learned towards actions that needs to be taken towards the building code for Fiji. The rising sea level definitely goes unnoticed. Now, the Fijian government are working to relocate homes that are under threat due to sea level rise, or in this case, saltwater intrusion that are affecting their food security. So the 2 big threats that is in the disaster sphere that are affecting our building codes in Fiji are strong cyclones as well as rising sea level. And these are the elements that are being factored in to the building code to ensure that it is sustainable in the long run. Next, please. In terms of the housing sector, over the years, the National Disaster Management Office, after a disaster, conducts a detailed damage assessment in an event of a category 5, a post-disaster need assessment. And what we've noticed is that the housing sector comes no surprise that it is the sector that is receiving the most cost of damage. Second to that is education, but again, these are education or schools, infrastructure that goes back to housing. Due to the number of, or in this case, the increasing damage that has incurred in our housing sector, the Fiji National Disaster Management Office, the Ministry of Infrastructure, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Housing, the Ministry of Economy have come together to try and work out a solution on how best we can have or improve our housing sector to be more resilient to natural hazard, given that every disaster that are now happening are now impacting our housing sector. Next, please. Institutional challenges. So what are some of the things that limits the current national building code to the environment that we are now facing? Access to a person living with disability. Again, the current building code was developed in the 90s. There was not a lot of focus around a person with disability, and therefore the revision of this building code is now a need than ever before to take into account person living with disability. Localization, the development of Fiji's building code needs to be contextualized to local events, needs to be contextualized to local models, needs to be contextualized to the materials that we have locally. And therefore, that element is missing in the revised building code. So these are a few things that the joint task force are now looking into to ensure that the revised building code is comprehensive enough to take into account some of these elements. Affordability, Fiji needs to ensure, or in this case, we are looking at a building code that is not developed not to be used, but a building code that can be used both at rural and urban dwellers. So having a set of building code that will work for our rural community, having a set of building codes that will work for our urban communities, equally important to ensure that it is adopted and it is also utilized. And that leads on to the other point that I'm also stressing, the fact that we need to reinforce it. And for us to reinforce it, we need to ensure that localization and adoption to local knowledge is factored in the building code. Last but not the least, as I'd mentioned, the revision of the building code came about the work or the effort put in place by other ministries that are now coming in to support the revision of this building code. And we are grateful for that because the experiences they brought from their ministry will enable the building code to be comprehensive enough to take into account all the different issues that we are now facing in Fiji. So it's not only about strengthening policies, it's not only about aligning building code to existing policies, but also bringing in the actual natural hazard that is now happening more frequent in our region that needs to be recognized than ever before. Next, please. The proposed improvement to the code, in addition to what I had mentioned earlier, the net zero carbon, as we speak, government is promoting and is passionate about net zero carbon by 2050. There are a few projects that we've had ongoing, the renewable energy driven systems such as natural ventilation and natural lighting. This is something that the building machinery government is now looking into to ensure that renewable energy is, is promoted not only at urban centers, but as well as our rural community. The relocation, or in this case, the partial relocation of Narikoso late last year in December, government made sure that there was enough. Not only are we relocating communities to higher ground, but there is the building that was built to Cat 4 standard. The structures that were done to ensure the safetyness of those inside. In addition to that, government also made sure that there were water tanks, that there were solar panels. So these are elements that we are now encouraging or promoting so that our people are more resilient now than ever before. The low carbon materials to be used, again, this is something that our engineers and our local expertise are now doing. Further, in addition to hybrid seawalls, we are working on innovative solutions that are not friendly to the environment, but also will ensure that the threat of that our future generations do not come under threat. So in order for them to be protected, the development of net zero carbon is now a priority for government to ensure that those that are coming after us will not face the same implications that we are currently facing. Next, please. The review of the National Building Code will need to take into future climate projections. As I'd mentioned, science is becoming more predictive now than ever before. There's a lot of technology that are now available. There's a lot of modeling that are available that will enable us to predict where we're heading in terms of climate change. In this case, where we're also heading in terms of development. The Fijian government is passionate about ensuring safetyness of the Fijian people. We are now doing climate risk profiling. We are also now looking into modeling high-risk vulnerable community so that our decision makers are driven by science, so we can better advise the public about areas that they need to build their homes that not only will benefit them now, but also future children that are coming after that. Next, please. So what are the emerging lessons learned from and recommendations? The Build Back Better concept, these are lessons learned after every disaster. Normally the ministry after any disaster conducts and after action review. So we look at what went well, what didn't go well. When it comes to the shelter cluster, this is something that we try and improve. What are some innovative solutions that we can improvise to help our community bring their life back to normalcy? So we work with our technical people to ensure that the new strategies that are now in place will ensure the safetiness of the people of Fiji. Identify proper sites that are safe for constructions. As I had mentioned before, the current building code does not have a flood map for Fiji. This is something that is on discussion, to have a flood map for Fiji so that people are aware when they build, they know the risks that are involved when it comes to building their home. So this is a priority for government, and this is something we will continue to do to ensure that we better inform our developers and our people to ensure that they build resilient infrastructure. The need to ensure buildings are accessible to a person living with disability or our elderly or a vulnerable group. This is something that's very important in an event of a disaster. We ensure that those that are vulnerable needs are also looked at. Blending international and local knowledge is very important. This is the term that we normally generalize it as localization. Integrating traditional knowledge as well as technical or international expert so that we can come up with an innovative solution that will happen or that will benefit Fiji as a whole. Align the implementation of existing policies. Last but not the very least, since the last building code was developed, a lot of our policies have come into act, such as the Fiji 20 Development Plan. We have the Natural Disaster Management Act, the approved National Disaster Risk Reduction Policy, the National Housing Policy, the Climate Change Act that was just recently approved. So all these policies and act were not there back then when the building code of Fiji was developed. So the new upcoming building code will have to be aligned to this existing legislation to ensure it's resilient as well as moving towards the near future that it's in line with government's priority. Next, please. Last but not the least, I'd like to acknowledge a few ministries I mentioned earlier. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Asian Development Bank for the support that they've given us to the review of our National Building Code, the formation of our joint task force, which is now constitution of Ministry of Health, Infrastructure, Housing, the Institute of Engineers, Ministry of Rural Maritime Development, the Fiji Construction Industry, as well as the Ministry of Commerce, Trade, Tourism, and Transport. As you can see, the constituency of this joint task force is not only a ministry, it's a collection of ministry, a collection of wealth that will come to the table to discuss how important this building code is and how relevant it will be for Fiji as we move to the near future. Next, please. Thank you very much. I believe that concludes my presentation. I will be available online should there be any question.
Thank you very much, Vasiti, for proposing the climate-sensitive design in the building code updating. It is our great pleasure to work with you on that. We can also see your determination to apply the new building code in urban and rural areas. We really look forward to learning from your experience and sharing it with other Pacific countries. I see some questions already. Can we keep all the questions for the panel discussion? Thank you. Next, let's welcome Steve Blake. He is a Principal Urban Development Specialist at ADB Pacific Department. Steve is a civil engineer and has worked for ADB since 2005. Originally from PNG, Steve is very passionate about improving the lives of the people in Pacific. And he has spent most of his 36-year career working on water, sanitation, and other urban development projects in Pacific developing nations. He will share with us how ADB works on water security and climate resilience. Steve, floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Jingmin. Rananim, Yokwe, Maori. Hi, hopefully you can hear me okay. Is that okay?
Okay, Steve.
Yep, thank you very much. Okay, as Jingmin mentioned, my name is Steve Blake. I'm from ADB's Pacific Department's Urban and Water Division. Thanks for joining the session. I hope it's interesting and I hope it's informative. I hope I don't spend too long. Thank you. And next slide, please, Lass. Providing water to the people of the Pacific that is equitable, reliable, affordable, and sustainable is already a major challenge. Climate change brings a whole new set of problems which amplify these challenges further. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change with more frequent and severe droughts, loss of freshwater reserves due to saline intrusion as sea levels rise, particularly on the atolls, more frequent sea flooding because of storm surge, which contaminates groundwater reserves, higher rainfall intensities and increased sediment export in streams and rivers, and higher demand for water as temperature rises. Next slide, please, Les. So, mainstreaming of adaptive measures into our operations is essential to cope with these added climate change stresses. Some adaptive measures include more efficient use of existing water resources by minimizing losses from water supply assets, advocating water conservation at the household, local and national level, diversifying water sources and the use of non-traditional water sources such as desalination and water from air technologies, which use renewable energy sources to offset increased energy requirements, and increasing investments in water treatment. I'd like to share a couple of examples and case studies of how climate change adaptation is being implemented in ADB's Pacific Water Project. Next slide, please. Thanks. The first case is South Tarawa in Kiribati. South Tarawa is the most populated and administrative centre in Kiribati. It's highly dependent on rainwater harvesting and the fragile Bonriki freshwater lens for its water supply. Climate change, particularly more frequent and longer droughts, sea level rise and ocean flooding threaten the security of its water supply. Next slide, please, Lass. To improve South Tarawa's water security, a range of measures are being implemented by the government, which target minimizing of water losses by replacement of the water supply distribution network. It's a wholesale replacement. Developing new water technologies by the construction of 2 reverse osmosis desalination plants. And accompanied with that is a solar PV array, which will ensure that the desalination plants are energy neutral, and strengthening community awareness on water-related issues. It may sound like a fairly simple project, but I can assure you it's very challenging and quite large. Next slide, please. I'll give you an example of where rainfall intensity is creating a problem. Honiara in Solomon Islands, water supply systems that rely on surface and spring water sources are being increasingly stressed due to a combination of damage to water supply catchments and increasing rainfall intensities, which is a climate change impact. 40% of Honiara's water supply is sourced from one source, the Kwajalein Spring. Logging in the Kwajalein catchment and more frequent higher intensity rainfall is leading to increased sediment export and higher turbidity of the water sources. Turbidity is a water safety issue. As spring water from Kwajalein Spring is not filtered prior to distribution, the water source has to be shut down when the turbidity of the water source exceeds safe levels. And that's actually 25 NTU if you're interested. In 2019, the Kwajalein Spring was shut down for a total of 59 days due to high turbidity levels. This created water shortage throughout Honiara and led to hardship of its residents. Climate change modelling of the catchment predicts higher rainfall intensities in Honiara, and the number of days that the Kwajalein spring would need to be shut down due to high turbidity of the spring is predicted to rise to about 120 days, or about a third of the year by 2050. So that's not very far away. We're seeing that already. We're seeing increasing frequency of shutdowns of Kwajalein. Next slide, please, Lass. So to address this problem, Solomon Water, which is the urban water utility in Solomon Islands, is constructing a water treatment plant to address the turbidity and will eliminate or at least significantly reduce the need to shut down the water source. More importantly, Solomon Water is actually working with the communities that live within the catchment and the traditional landowners to stop logging activities and forest clearing, and to develop alternate livelihoods, including paid ecosystem services, which may include paid carbon schemes. Next slide, please, and the last case I'll just touch on. This is in Chuk. This is a need to diversify water sources and expand water supply services. Chuk is highly exposed to natural hazards and climate change impacts. Households on Weno, which is the capital and main urban centre of Chuk, rely very heavily on rainwater harvesting and the public water supply system for water. Droughts are becoming more frequent, and over the last 20 years, there have been 5 significant dry periods which have led to water shortages. The latest was last year, from February to April, approximately 3 months, which led to substantial water restrictions and hardship for households. The public water supply system is supplied mainly from deep wells, which are expensive to operate and dependent on fossil fuels, and are prone to drying up during long periods of drought, as we saw last year. There was next slide, please. Okay, so CPUC is plans to address these issues, and is actually in the process of addressing these issues by developing a new water source on the Wichita River. You can see in the photograph, it's a small stream. The aim here is to diversify its water sources and to reduce its dependence on deep wells. It's also planning to expand the coverage of its water supply to all households on Weno, and also its sanitation services as well. CPUC is also planning to introduce new water technologies and renewable energy sources on its outer islands to maximize water supply security for all people in Chuk State. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, look, I probably will leave it there. Thanks for joining this session. I'll hand over now to Mr. Joseph Pedron, my very good friend and a colleague from KAJUR in Ibai. He'll tell you a little bit more about water issues on his home island of Ibai in Marshall Islands. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Steve. We really know how important for ADB to help the Pacific countries to diversify the water resource, including desalination and also more rainwater harvesting. Let's also hear the story from the other side, as Steve mentioned. Let's welcome Mr. Joseph Pedro. He will share us how they work with ADB in Marshall Islands to manage their water scarcity. Joseph serves as the general manager of Kwajalein Atoll Joint Utility Resources, the power and utilities provider for e-buy and the sets of islands connected via causeway. He was born and raised in e-buy, Marshall Island, and studied business management and computer science. For more than a decade, Joseph served as a data analyst responsible for designing and improving cost-effective work method for Kwajalein Range Services, which was a joint venture between Bigtail and Lockheed Martin. He also worked as a network analyst in telecom tech, managing the radiation monitoring system for safety hazard for the radar system on Royal Nemo. He also serves as a procurement manager for Marshall's Energy Company, a power utility located in the capital city of Majuro in Marshall Island. Welcome, Joseph. I handed the floor to you.
Thank you, Jingmin. Thank you, Steve.
Joe, you're breaking up there.
How about now?
Not much better. Thanks.
Okay. An honor to be a part of this Pacific Regional Hub. Smart site. To start with this presentation. Next.
Sorry, Joe, your voice is a bit broken. Can you turn off your video so we can save some space of the bandwidth?
Turn off the view.
Yeah, please continue.
Yeah. Looks like I'm a rainbow today. Please. The Marshall Islands. A long time ago, volcanoes, sitting on a submerged. Marshall Islands is 59, roughly 59,000.
Sorry, Joseph, we cannot hear you clearly. It's repeating. Your voice is very
Echo.
Yeah, maybe we have a try again. Please continue. Sorry, Joseph, we cannot hear you. Can I suggest that we move to next presentation and then we come back to you to see if the connection is better? Okay, Joseph?
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, now it's okay. I don't know why their voice is not so clear when you just talk. Okay, we try later.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. Sorry, we come back to you later. Now let's move to another important topic, the solid waste management. Let's welcome Ms. Vivian Castro Wardridge. She will talk about the climate change resilience through solid waste management in the Pacific. Vivian is a senior urban development specialist with ADB's Pacific Department. She is an urban planner and has been working to improve the urban surveys, such as water supply, sanitation, and solid waste management in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific since 2006. She has worked for ADB since 2012. Now she is currently leading urban services improvement and infrastructure projects in Nauru, Solomon Island, and Vanuatu. Vivian, please.
Thanks, Jingmin, and greetings, everyone. So nice to be here with you today. And I very much enjoyed the earlier presentations. So as Jingmin said, my topic today is how improving solid waste management can strengthen resilience to climate change. And I'll share some case studies of ADB support for solid waste management in RMI and the Solomon Islands. Next slide, please. So while solid waste management is not the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions globally, improved solid waste management can contribute to the goal of global net zero by mid-century and keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, while providing many other benefits to the environment and society. So first, the goal should be to reduce the amount of waste in the first place. Less energy is needed to extract, transport, and process raw materials and to manufacture products when people reduce their consumption or reuse things, or when products are made with less material. When energy demand decreases, fewer fossil fuels are burned, of course, and less carbon dioxide is emitted to the atmosphere. And making goods from recycled materials typically requires less energy than making goods from virgin materials. Second, waste prevention and recycling of paper products can leave more trees standing in the forests, which is important because they continue to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Next slide, please. And improved solid waste management through the development of incineration, sanitary landfills, and recycling is likely to have a large positive impact on reducing greenhouse gases and on mitigating climate change when compared with the ongoing use of dump sites and indiscriminate dumping of rubbish, which can be a major challenge. So the major greenhouse gas emissions from the waste sector are landfill methane, but because waste management decisions are often made locally without the requirement to quantify greenhouse gas mitigation, the importance of the waste sector for reducing greenhouse gas emissions has been underestimated. Landfill methane emissions from developed countries have been largely stabilized, but quite interestingly, landfill methane emissions from developing countries, including in the Pacific, are increasing as more controlled landfilling practices are implemented. And these emissions could be reduced by both accelerating the introduction of engineered gas recovery and also reducing the use of dump sites and haphazard dumping of waste. The technology decisions for waste disposal often depend on many variables, and we'll talk about those a little bit later in the case studies, but these can include waste quantity and characteristics, cost and financing issues, of course, available land area, which is critical, especially in the Pacific region, collection and transport consideration, and regulatory constraints, to name a few. Incineration with advanced emission controls are a proven technology and desirable where land is severely constrained, but they can be more costly to install and operate than controlled landfilling with landfill gas recovery. However, landfills do continue to produce methane for decades, and therefore incineration, composting, and other strategies to reduce landfill waste should be considered as part of any strategic decision to improve waste and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And how is global warming manifesting in our cities? We know that climate change impacts include increased intensity of rainfall, which Steve has alluded to earlier in his presentation. This can lead to erosion, landslides, and flooding, which is important for my presentation, as drainage systems are overwhelmed. So urban floods damage property, floodwaters often get mixed with solid waste and raw sewage and pollute water bodies and even water sources. Another climate change impact is drought, which leads to substantial hardship, insecurity, and makes it difficult to practice good hygiene. So this is not directly linked to solid waste management, but just to point out that water is increasingly precious and fragile resource that we must protect. As we heard earlier from Steve in his presentation with the examples from Kiribati and Solomon Islands. So any threat to water, including from solid waste management, needs to be looked at very carefully. Next slide. And floods are caused by several factors, but climate change is leading to heavier rainfall in short amounts of time, stressing drainage systems. And rapid urbanization and proliferation of informal settlements means that natural drains are being blocked and floodplains can no longer perform natural ecosystem functions. And open dumping of waste finds its way into drains and clogs them, exacerbating local flooding problems. And floods take waste into rivers and oceans. So not 1 square mile of surface ocean anywhere on Earth is free of plastic pollution now. And ocean health is gaining more traction as an important global issue, as we also understand the ocean's role as the great regulator of climate and as a carbon sink, which has been a big topic in this COP26. So we discussed the fragility of water resources in the Pacific, and solid waste management solid waste can pollute groundwater through leachate if landfill is not well designed or managed, and the backing up of drains and sewers with waste leads to release of raw sewage during flood events that pollutes the environment and can carry waste into the ocean. So, a key message here is that solid waste management is not the only contributing factor to flood and to less water security, but it is an important one that we cannot ignore. Next slide, please. So now we'll move into the case studies, and starting with ADB's support in the Republic of Marshall Islands. Next slide, please. ADB is working with the government of RMI to improve solid waste management in the 2 main population centers of Ibai and Majuro. Government is facing several environmental and technical challenges. First, being at sea level, Ibai dump site is in danger of being inundated because of sea level rise. In Majuro, the design capacity of the dump site has been far exceeded, and solid waste is piled high and could topple into the ocean at any time. Current situation with an uncontrolled dump site and haphazard dumping around the islands causes an environmental nuisance also in terms of bad odors and pests, and the leachate is polluting the ocean, lagoon, and groundwater. The dump sites generate greenhouse gas emissions, primarily methane, which continues during the decomposition of organic waste at the site, as I mentioned earlier. And the development of new landfills is just not feasible. There's no space. For Majuro, the feasibility studies the ADB is supporting will also assess how to handle end-of-life vehicles and large appliances and coordinate closely with other development partners on this. Next slide, please. So the projects will build and operate high temperature incinerators for Ibai and Majuro, with the key objective to reduce the volume of waste. So just to note, energy production from incineration is not the key consideration for RMI. Key consideration is to reduce the volume of waste, as there's no land for landfilling left. The targets are to reduce the volume of solid waste by about 95% and the weight by about 80% through incineration, so very significant. And Ibai, the project is expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 73% annually by incinerating the present quantity of waste. And in terms of climate change adaptation measures, the projects will strengthen the seawalls surrounding the dump sites in both locations to adapt to sea level rise, protect infrastructure, and prevent solid waste from sliding into the adjacent lagoon and ocean. So that concludes the case study for RMI. Next slide, please. And now I'll just share a bit about ADB's planned support to improve solid waste management for the capital city, Honiara of the Solomon Islands. Next slide, please. So the levels of pollution in Honiara are high. Large quantities of plastic waste enter the waterways, and this obstructs the flow of water, causing flooding, and can also lead to stagnant waters that are breeding grounds for disease vectors. And this pollution has been linked to disease outbreaks, including a dengue fever epidemic in 2013. ADB has supported the development of a 10-year roadmap through a highly collaborative process with several government agencies, private sector, development partners, and civil society, as the efforts of all these players are required to improve and sustain solid waste management systems. As you can see here, the approved roadmap has increasing targets for the volume of waste collected, composted, and recycled over time, and behavior change is a really key element of the roadmap. ADB is planning to support the government to implement the roadmap, and we're in the final stages of securing ADB approval of a $3 million grant to prepare a project that would involve infrastructure, but also support to strengthen the enabling environment for improved coverage of services and quality of services by the Honiara City Council. One aspect of the future project that I want to highlight is services for residents of informal settlements. About 40% of Honiara's population lives in informal settlements and does not have access to waste collection services. And ADB's project preparation grant will help work with the City Council to design a workable approach to improve coverage in informal settlements. Without extending collection services to informal settlements, any expected benefits from solid waste management project, expected benefits like unclogging drains, reducing urban flood risks, protecting waterways from pollution, and reducing greenhouse emissions will just not be achieved. So this is really a critical aspect of the proposed project. Next slide, please. And the project team has done some initial calculations of greenhouse gas emissions reductions that can be expected through a reduction in haphazard dumping and burning of rubbish and the closure of the current dump site, and through the conversion of methane to less harmful CO2 at a new waste management facility in the future. And preliminary studies have found that the potential for reducing these emissions is quite significant, as you can see here. Next slide, please. So this concludes my presentation today on how improving solid waste management is an important climate change adaptation and mitigation measure, and how this links with the core COP26 objectives here on the screen. And just key points I would like to recap. First, we need more resources for solid waste management, tapping into climate and ocean health financing, and also support from developed countries to developing countries in terms of finance and facilitating the recycling of goods that just cannot be recycled, including on most Pacific islands at present. Second, we need projects to consider the connections between solid waste management, flood management, and wastewater management, and ocean health as well, and for projects to consider the most suitable technologies in a given context. Third and final point, we need to create platforms between government, development partners, private sector, and civil society for collective action to do more and better solid waste management and build resilience in the Pacific. Thank you sincerely for your time today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, and over to you, Jingmin.
Thank you very much, Vivian. Your closing thoughts really very well reflect the ADB's position at the ongoing COP26. That's keeping this 1.5 degree, providing the financing, raising the ambition of financing to $100 billion for climate financing by 2030. And also achieving zero emissions in future by all sorts of approaches. Okay, now maybe let's go back to Joseph's presentation. Let's try again if he can be connected, because he's presenting from Marshall Islands, from the eBay. The connection is not so stable. So welcome back. Joseph, please continue. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll try again. Can you hear me okay?
So far, so good, Joe.
Sorry, Joseph, to interrupt you. I cannot hear you clearly.
There's some communication issue between the office and at the moment.
Excuse me, Joseph, is that okay for me to ask Steve to present on behalf of you?
Oh, yes, please go ahead.
Is that okay? I know you have been working very closely for several years, so I'm sure Steve knows the situation there, and also you have discussed the presentation slides to when you prepared for that. Is that correct? So can I ask Steve to present on behalf of you?
If Steve is okay with it, I'm happy.
I'll certainly give it a try, Joe. I know I can't do it justice as you would, but let me try. And please, if you can, jump in wherever you think I'm not doing a good job. So thanks, Les. Can we move to the next slide, please?
Yeah, and also Joseph, could you please stay to join our panel discussion? Hopefully the connection would be better then, okay?
I sure will. Really happy.
Okay. Okay, so Steve, I hand it to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And once again, apologies if I don't do your presentation justice. Yokwe, it's a Marshallese word. It's derived from two words, a combination of ia is rainbow and kwe is you, so you rainbow. So it's warm greetings extended through me to you from Joe. Next slide, please. The Marshall Islands, or officially the Republic of the Marshall Islands, it's an independent country north of the equator. It's about halfway between the Philippines and Hawaii. It has a huge territory. It's more than, if I remember correctly, more than 2 million square kilometers, of which only less than 1% is land. And it comprises, I think, from memory, 15 or 16 atolls and 1 or 2 raised islands. As the slide says, it's a series of atolls, which are old volcanoes, comprising coral limestone and sand islets around as the rims of submerged volcanoes or collapsed volcanoes. The Marshall Islands is part of Micronesia. Its population is around about just a little shy of 60,000. So most of the population lives in 2 centers, one being Majuro, which Vivian mentioned. It's about 35,000 people. And the other being Ibai, which in Kwajalein Atoll has a population which fluctuates, but if I remember correctly, it's somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people, depending on the time of year. Next slide, please, Les. Okay. There's been a lot of work actually looking at climate change impacts on Marshall Islands and Kiribati next door and Tuvalu. Most of the Marshall Islands is very low lying. It's very little is above 3 meters. In fact, I think the highest point within the Marshall Islands is actually in Majuro, and that's the top of the Rye Rock garbage tip. So most of it's very low. It's really subject to seawater flooding, particularly during storm surges and king tides, both from the ocean side, but also from the lagoon side. I've seen some very substantial flooding on Ebi coming in from the western or the lagoon side. Next slide, please. So Ebi is located in Kwajalein Atoll. It's supposedly, reputedly, the largest atoll in the world. The land mass is tiny, but the lagoon is very large, as you can see on the slide. Heights within the atoll of land range is typically averages about a little less than 6 feet or 2 meters. Most of the islands are sand, but however, that sand layer is usually fairly thin. Dig down about half a meter to a meter, you start hitting the cornice that underlies the islands. Next slide, please. So the island of Ebi, its place is actually very close to my heart. Actually, it's very small. It's around about 80 acres or 31 hectares. It has a population, as I mentioned earlier, of up to 15,000. It's extremely densely populated. It has population densities approaching to the most densely populated areas of the world, including parts of Hong Kong. So it's very, very densely populated. Household levels are high. I think the average household size is 9 persons per household, but I know of 1 or 2 cases where there's up to 40 people living in one household. It's a young population. About half of the people on Ebi are less than 18. Next slide, please. So it's a highly vulnerable community. It's this global warming, sea level rise, water shortages are common, but hopefully not too common, John. I think we've gone a long way to addressing that problem. Flooding is a major problem, particularly some of the low-lying areas. Actually, there's parts of Ebi which are actually below sea level. So whenever there is inundation coming in or sea flooding, basically there's quite severe flooding. Hurricanes and cyclones, typhoons are a problem. There have been some major typhoons. I think the last one, major typhoon which caused major damage on Ebi was in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, they're devastating. And of course, there's health issues. Vivian touched on some of the health issues on Ebi that are associated with solid waste handling, but there's also a major issue, but it's declining, fortunately, related to a waterborne disease. And that's because of the scarcity of water. Next slide, please. Okay. So impacts on the water sector. One of my first memories, and this is a personal observation, one of my first memories of Ebi was I went to a community meeting to discuss a water project we were planning at the time. And it was raining and people were celebrating because, water is life. People love, it's a major part of their lives. It's really important. And in the past, during dry periods when rainwater tanks run dry, and they run dry very, very quickly because households are large and they run through their reserves within 3 or 4 days. There was a reliance on going to the US Army military base, which is 4 kilometers away, and bringing back containers full of water. That still goes on, but nowhere near as much as it did in the past. So water is a very key element of day-to-day life on Ebi. Next slide, please. Okay, some of the water sector impacts are rainwater harvesting. Well, as I mentioned, rainwater harvesting is a major source of water, but there is a major dry period during the year from January to May. Sometimes there's almost no water, so there is a need to actually look at other water sources. So rainwater tanks, there is a problem with contamination and of both the rainwater catchments and the tanks themselves, and that's led to an increase in waterborne disease. Waterborne disease has been high, and that's because of insufficient water supply. So with the commissioning of a new desalination plant on Ibai back in September 2017, the availability of water has increased very, very substantially. The desal plant is actually operated by KAJUR, which Joe is the general manager, and it is able to provide water to the whole community on Ibai 24/7. So next slide, please. Okay, there is a desalination plant. It is operated by KAJUR. It has an interesting feature. It was delivered under a design, build and operate contract. And it has real-time monitoring in Australia and in India, where the KAJUR's operators are alerted when there are potential problems arising. It's very, very effective. It's really had transformative impacts on Ibai, as the availability of water has increased substantially. KAJUR and ADB have been tracking waterborne disease incidents since the commissioning of the plant, and there is a steady decline, actually, in the numbers of reported cases of gastroenteritis in particular and diarrhea since the plant was commissioned almost 4 years ago. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, KAJUR is also improving its water distribution system. There's been a major rehabilitation undertaken. It's also rehabilitated its sewer system as well. So basically, the entire population of Ibai has access to the centralized sewer system as well as water supply. I could go on forever, but there's some very interesting features here to conserve water. Ibai has a saltwater sewer system similar to what South Tara uses. It's quite efficient, but it is very energy intensive. So there is a need to raise public awareness on water conservation, particularly at household levels, on wise use of both fresh water and salt water for sanitation. KAJUR is planning on expanding its services to the adjacent islet of Kwajalein. That's about 10 kilometers north of Ibai, joined by a causeway, and it will install a relatively small RO plant. Okay, next slide, please. I'm being pushed along. Okay, I think that's it. Joe, I hope I did justice to your presentation. I'm really sorry you couldn't present it. Back to you, Jingmin.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Joseph. Komo Tata, thank you. Your presentation done by Steve and you jointly. It's a one ADB team, yeah. Thank you for bringing us to this very beautiful and unique Marshall Islands. We look forward to continuing working with you and improving the water security. Now we finish all our presentations. We would come to the panel discussion. So can I ask all the speakers to turn on your videos so we can have the panel discussion? Yeah, thank you. Really nice. Very nice to see all of you again. I see a lot of participants, and really I'm so encouraged to see that we have so many very good colleagues and key players all together here to work on this urban resilience. Specifically, I see Lucia here. She is the Chief Executive Officer from Pacific Water and Wastewater Association, this PWWA. Hi, Lucia, so nice to see you. So it's our great pleasure to also have her here. So maybe I would like to ask Lucia if she has any questions to our speakers. Thank you, Lucia.
Thank you, Qingming, and thank you, everyone. I'm also really happy that I was able to get the link just before, actually, just before the session. So thank you very much. I was. First of all, can I just make a comment? I was very, very pleased to see that there is a clear message coming through from all the presentations of working in an integrated manner with all, with all the ministries and industries and, people that are involved in terms of climate change. The presentation from Vasiti was an excellent presentation, but I'm glad to hear of the message coming through that you need to work with communities and work with other agencies that deal with climate change to ensure that 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 the building code is in fact something that is suitable and adaptable to all to rural communities as well as urban communities. And I'm really glad to hear that, because I'm thinking of our rural communities and how a building code in Samoa, for example, would be suitable for salmon valleys. In terms of the changes in climate. And I'm sorry that Joseph, but I think Steve did a good job of making that presentation for Joe from KAJUR. And I'm really glad of the message that came through, that you're wanting to go into advocating the saving water and conserving water, and working with communities to ensure that water is used properly and that there is no waste. But I think the one that really kind of like depressed me in a way is Vivian's presentation on solid waste. I mean, if you look at that and you look at the picture of the Marshall Islands with all that waste in the ocean, it just it's astounding, and it's also depressing to see all that. So I guess really to start off with, I mean, I wanted to say that, but I also wanted to ask Qingming, you and also your colleagues in ADB, whether there is that sort of move now to integrate the investments that you make in infrastructure, in climate change infrastructure, in water infrastructure, where if there is a move for the bank to be more accommodating of the greater need to integrate the different aspects of, and the social economic aspects of the investments that you make as a financing institution. Thank you, Qingming, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lucia. I'm really glad that many of our participants, including you, have noticed this, how serious the solid waste issue here in the island. So that's the reason why we really put all our effort to work on this issue. And then, as you asked, if we consider how to integrate their financing, yes, we are. For example, as Steve just mentioned, in the desalination plant, we always combine their solar PV power generation to offset their energy consumption, also to do better for the climate change adaptation. Not only that, we also have a lot of different approaches for integration. Take this chance because I see many questions pile up already. Can I just move on to the first question? That's from Bapan to Vasiti. Excellent presentation and initiatives on building codes. Do the current codes incorporate the future risks and some of the recent hazard assessment done for Fiji, such as tsunami hazard and cyclone inundation? And also building code linked to other risk reduction strategies, such as spatial planning. Please, Vasiti.
Thank you, and thank you again for the good question. With regards to the element of risk-informed analysis in the current building code, as I had mentioned in my presentation, the current building code for Fiji is at 1980, and through the joint task force from other ministry collectively, we've managed to secure support from ADB to revise our code come 2022. So surely a lot has happened. Again, as part of my presentation, I did show the number of cyclones and the frequency of the cyclone that is now happening in our region, and all the lessons learned that will come off that, together with all the tsunami siren exercise that we're currently doing. We are now going to install an additional 26 sirens, tsunami sirens, with the support of the Japanese government. Through that, there was a lot of risk analysis modeling that happened behind the scene for the site, for the locations of this site. And so all these exercise and lesson learned will be inbuilt towards the updated, or in this case, the process of updating Fiji's national building code. Thank you.
If I can add to the answers that have come through, I'll introduce myself as the Director of Buildings and Government Architect from the Ministry of Infrastructure, Andrew Petty.
Please, can you turn on your video as well, so we can say hello to you?
Anybody can see me off screen? Okay. Good afternoon from Fiji. Andrew Penny, Director of Buildings and Government Architect with the Ministry of Infrastructure. The tabulated cyclones that have been hitting the country, presence and occurrence of Category 5 strength cyclones, and thus you'll find out later on as the code comes through that we'll be pushing towards Category 3 ratings as a proactive, assessment of risks and anticipations of upcoming weather patterns. Also on the tsunami address and risk assessments, we are in the process also of mapping flood-prone and vulnerable coastal areas for the country. So those two are part of the pipeline and additional works that NDMO is assisting us and spreading the awareness in the region with ADB. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this good observation and comments. The updating of the building code really needs an integration of all key players' work, and we are very, very encouraged to hear from you what you have done. Let's work very closely on that. Thank you very much. So maybe I can move to next question. That's for Steve from Terry. Any plan to adopt a payment for ecosystem service to incentive the local community to shift from logging activities to the protection of water resource, please?
Thanks, Terry. Great question. And yes, in Solomon Islands, there's quite a big effort to actually work with communities to provide alternatives to logging, particularly in water source catchment areas. Solomon Water has actually established a catchment protection division, and it's looking at introducing other paid environmental services, or not only harnessing carbon credits, which is has been done and is being done elsewhere in the Pacific, but also looking at other forms of environmental tourism, and other means of discouraging logging in the catchment. Part of the work that Solomon Water do is restoration of deforested areas as well, and that's something I'm actually very proud to say we're supporting as well. So hopefully that answers your question, Terry. Thanks, Jingmin.
Thank you, Steve. And this question is to Vivian. How to advocacy there improve the solid waste management extended to informal settlement. Most of them have no land entitlement and so also very less empowered in their local community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jingmin. I think this question was from Terry, and it's a very good one. And it's something we'll be spending quite a bit of effort on to get it right. So we've included, we put aside some resources in the preparation grant to really work closely with the communities and find a workable solution that we can scale up in the proposed project later. So I think we'll have to look at things like making services convenient. So, it's not surprising that people just dump their waste or burn it if they don't have access to any service. So we need to be able to provide bins in convenient locations. And I think something that we'll look at very carefully is how we can use the community as part of the service chain. So in partnership with the city council, maybe through women's groups or youth groups, trying to see if we can maybe have some community contracting with people who could be, or groups that can be influential in the community to build this kind of momentum or movement. And I think another idea that has come out quite strongly in our consultation so far is the need to really start with children. So having very strong behavior change campaigns in schools, advocating for 3 R's, or these days I've heard a lot of people use 4 R's, with the first R being to refuse. So for example, refusing single-use plastics from even arriving on the island. So anyway, these are some initial ideas, and we'll be fleshing these out, and I hope to be able to present back in such a forum in a few months. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. It's a very good initiative. That's to start from the students, from children at schools. So let's do it step by step. And I also see Jack Whelan is here. He is also a top expert on solid waste management and also other urban related issues. So I just wonder, Jack, if you have any questions here?
Or insights. Hi, Jack.
Yeah. Can you
Hi,
please
Vivian.
turn on your
Hi,
video?
Jingmin.
Yes, very nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. And thank you very much. It's an excellent webinar, very informative. I don't have any specific question, but I do want to just inform everyone about the launch of the new technical assistance facility for the small island development states, which is called IRIS. And also on this webinar today is my colleague, Jong Park. And I wonder whether, Jong, you might like to just quickly introduce IRIS and explain that there may be many opportunities in the future for cooperation and collaboration, not only with ADB, but with many of the other agencies that are represented. So perhaps, Jingmin, with your permission, I might ask Jong to introduce IRIS. Thank you.
Yes, please. That's our great pleasure to have some new partners and initiative here, please. Can you hear us?
Jong, are you available?
So maybe we can move to next question and then let me know when Jong is ready. Okay, Jack?
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, Yeah, ask John, please join. It seems a lot of questions go to Vasiti. There's another one. Can I ask you again, Vasiti? It seems your presentation is extremely popular. So how does Fiji government ensure that the building code is strengthened at the community level? And who or which arm of the government would monitor this? And this is in fact together with another question that does the building code consider people with disabilities and accessibilities to wash facility? So all linked to the building code, please.
Thank you. And again, thank you for the question. With regards to the first part of the question, my answer to that is localization. I did mention that a few of the principles or the projects that we are now doing, we conduct what we call an after-action review after every cyclone. We register the comments that are coming in from the community, but not only that, we've also seen traditional homes that have actually withstand category 3, category 4 cyclones. So we're going back to those homes, we're going back to the builders, the traditional builders, and we are discussing with them about ways that we can improve the current building code. The current building code, the good thing about the current building code is a lot of lessons learned that will be embedded to it. There's a lot of actions that government has undertaken that will lead or shape the upcoming building code. And government has also done a lot of, in this case, a lot of improvements when it comes to disability access. I did mention that when we did a partial relocation for Narikoso, we ensured that there were wheelchair ramps to all the homes that were relocated to new site. So not only is the new homes made accessible to homes that were now being threatened, but also having access to those that have some degree of disability. So government is taking those into consideration. It's quite passionate about it. And even though we are going to update the building code come next year, there's a lot of lessons learned and there's a lot of actions that we've already done to embed, a person with disability, vulnerability, and there are policies that government already has in place that will ensure that the updated building code will be aligned to those policies that are now in place. With regards to which ministry will mainstream the building code at the community level, as I had mentioned, there is a joint task force that is now represented right across all ministries. Different ministries have different portfolios. When it comes to rural housing, that sits with the Ministry of Housing. But when it comes to rural development, that sits with the Ministry of Rural and Maritime Development, both of which are represented in the joint task force. So it's a whole of government approach towards this updating of Fiji building code. Thank you.
And if I could add on to that, Chairperson, the component of the question asking about enforcement is a challenging issue for us, and it will be the same for other countries in the Pacific, in the sense that we have in Fiji, urban high-rise 35-story buildings popping up that need to be strictly controlled with high-quality standards for wind loading and earthquake loading. And then we have on the opposite end, rural communities and informal settlements who are also where the question of affordability comes up. And so in setting up the new building code, the question is always affordability, and our response that will be fine-tuned in the new version is that we would like to see stages of compliance where informal settlements and less and affordability issues can apply for consideration. So we'll state what things have to be at Cat 5 for the urban high rises, and then we will allow in the code for special consideration to be given to on case-by-case basis. So that there could be staged compliance, perhaps starting from the construction processes down at the foundations. When you start the project, you definitely have to comply, and then as your building progresses, you get the compliance for the next level up, which would be walls, and then get another stage of compliance when the occupant has enough resources. to get onto the roof. But definitely there is going to be a clear target of resilient housing and infrastructure. And we would like to see staged compliances. So at the end of the day, depending on the availability of resources, that our damages in the housing component graph that has been presented by Director NTMO can be reduced, because at the moment it just shows that the effect of our informal housing and people who cannot afford is pushing up a lot of expense to the country, and maybe this is the same in other Pacific Island states as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I also understand that a review of implementation arrangements and the compliance enforcement is part of this building code review. It seems that there are so many interests in this updating of the building code, and that's our great pleasure to work with you on that. So let's work very closely, and we also look forward to learning more from you. And I just see Jack said that he would post the link of the information he mentioned in the chat box. The time is very close to 9 now, so let's wrap up. And really, thank you so much. Now come to the end of our session. What we learned is that the climate is already changing, and it would continue to change even as we reduce the emission. Improvement of urban resilience to climate change needs more integrated approaches, as Lucia mentioned, that both social and economic approaches, and also we really need to work together to deliver. So thank you so much for your participation. Kamo Tata, sorry that Joseph couldn't join us today due to their poor link. That also shows there's a lot for us to do to improve their situation in their island countries. And thank you so much, Vasiti. Your presentation is really well accepted. And many thanks to ADB team for preparing that. Stay safe and all the best. We would share the link, and please contact us if you want more information from our side. So thank you and bye-bye. Have a nice day and keep safe and all the best.
Thanks, Jingmin.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for your participation. Thank you to all.
Yeah.